Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this fourth CCAN webinar today. My name is Peter Barbrook Johnson. I'm one of the researchers working on CCAN. I will be chairing the webinar today. We're very lucky to have with us Justin Jagosz, who some of you may have heard his first webinar he held with us, giving us a nice introduction overview of realist evaluation and approaches. Today we're having a part two, as it were, where we're delving a little bit deeper into realist evaluation. Before I hand over to Justin, I just want to say a couple of words about CCAN for those who are less familiar. So CCAN stands for the Centre for the Evaluation of Complexity Across the Nexus. This is a research centre funded by UK research councils, and several government departments and agencies. Our basic remit is to pioneer, test, and promote innovative evaluation methods. And we're applying those methods across nexus areas, and the nexus being food, energy, water, and the environment. And the complexity comes in because that really underpins much of our approach. So we use complexity science, tools, and thinking to inform some of the innovative elements of the approaches we use. You can read more about our work at ccan.ac.uk. I just wanted to say a couple of words about the format of today's session. So Justin's going to be giving us a talk around about 50 minutes. It may be a bit shorter, a bit longer. And then we're going to have we have time, 25 minutes scheduled. We can use more or less as we see fit for a questions and answers session. Now, unfortunately, we're a victim of our own success in some ways. We have a lot of people joining us today, which means we can't have everyone talking over each other using the mic. So you'll notice everyone joining us today is muted, and you can submit your questions via the questions box, which you should be able to see on your GoToWebinar control panel, which popped up when you joined the webinar. It's towards the bottom, I think. But yeah, there's a questions box there where you can submit your questions. I would urge you to do that throughout the webinar, and then also obviously at the end, we can get a sort of as much of a discussion going as possible with questions coming through. And Justin's going to be sort of moderating them himself, picking the questions he thinks are most interesting, depending on how many we have. Well, hopefully we'll try and get through them all. So yeah, please do use the question box. That's very important for that session at the end. Okay, so that's me done. I'm going to hand over to Justin now. All I'm left for me to say thank you very much for him giving us a second session, and I'm handing over to you now, Justin.
Okay, well, thanks, Peter, and welcome to the second session for the CCAN webinar. And Peter, I think I have to. Okay. So I'm assuming that everybody can see my screen.
All looks good from there, Justin.
All looks good. Okay, good. Okay, so the title of this session is the Context+Mechanism Association, Mastering a Key Heuristic in Realist Evaluation for Innovating Complex Programs and Policy. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm an honorary research associate at the University of Liverpool, and I am the director for the Center for Advancement in Realist Evaluation and Synthesis. The website address is on the front page there, so you can check out the website. And I post my upcoming workshops and events on the website, along with other information about me. So you can feel free to look through that. Since 2003, and even a little bit before that, I have been intensifying my slate of annual realist methodology workshops in Liverpool, in London, and internationally. And this presentation is somewhat of a reflection of being in conversation with many people. I don't know, I've lost count now of how many conversations I've had about realist methodology and the application of realist methodology to various areas of inquiry. And it's been a tremendous privilege to be in this position where I'm really being exposed to so many different projects in different fields and working through some challenging issues in applying realist methodology. So this is, this presentation is really intended to, give back from that privileged perspective that I've gained, and hopefully stimulate your thinking around the application of realist methodology. I encourage you to think critically about the material I present. Don't take it for face value. It's not meant to tell you what is the right way or the wrong way to think. It's more to catalyze your own thinking. So there might be things in here that I've missed or that you can add on from your own experience. And that's exactly, the my hope for this, and the goal here is really just to continue a dialogue about how do you address complexity using the constructs from the realist approach. So so I'm going to start with some key points, and I think I need to move my control panel here so I can see this. If I click X, that says quit. I don't want to do that. Let me just move it to the bottom. Right, okay. So some key points that I want to share with you right off the bat. So I'm basically trying to give you some main messages just because we have very limited time here. So realist inquiry is operationalized through investigating generative causation via the context mechanism outcome heuristic. So there's some key words here: generative causation, and I've described the CMO as a heuristic, as has been described by Ray Pawson and others. So for those of you who are not familiar with the term heuristic, you can just think of it as the context mechanism outcome configuration as a working construct, a mental shortcut, or just a quick way of reminding us that we are to be looking at your inquiry through a lens of generative causation. And generative causation is understanding what underpins outcomes, or what generates outcomes, with this idea that there are mechanisms that are hidden or invisible or difficult to view or dormant or latent. And these are forces that actually produce outcomes, produce evidence, or produce outcomes. So in a research process, we talk about outcomes. So what produces outcomes? And we also say that outcomes are the product of a context mechanism association. So Nick Tilley and Ray Pawson, they've put out that equation, context plus mechanism equals outcome. And that's to say that there is an association between context and mechanism, and that outcomes can be disaggregated, you could say, or traced back to the context and mechanism interaction. But I'll be defining context and mechanism here for clarity. And the nature of the context mechanism association depends on the architecture of the program in question. So I'm introducing, it's somewhat of a metaphor here, the idea of an architecture, but it's something that I've found more and more useful when thinking about programs, to think about when you're theorizing programs using realist program theory. What you're doing is you're sort of sketching out the architecture of the program, or as you could say, the architectural blueprints of the program, how it's meant to work, its intrinsic structure, as well as how it is placed in context. So those are ways to think about what it is that I'll be presenting. This is you've probably all seen this. This is from Pawson and Tilley's 1997 book, Realistic Evaluation, which I highly recommend if you haven't read that. It's incredibly clarifying and lucid. And basically, they're saying that there is context, which is the larger field, and within that context, if the conditions are right, the context triggers mechanisms which produce outcomes. So we are saying that, as I have said before, and I've said in the first webinar, that mechanisms are thought of as being triggered under the right contexts. Okay, so that's something that we've already established. So in this presentation, I'm going to go a bit further. Now, I've showed this slide before as well, and it's basically the same idea of context, mechanism, outcome, but just visually diagrammed differently to suggest that mechanisms happen at a different level, different layer of the reality. And it's at that level that is underpinning and more difficult to observe and bring into an empirical testing process. But essentially, what I'm saying here is that a simple way to distinguish between context and mechanism is to think of the context as the background or the backdrop or the environment of a program, and the mechanism as the combination of the intervention resources and the stakeholder reasoning. So the actors involved, so they could be the participants, the recipients of a program, but they could also be implementers, frontline workers, managers, other people that have a stake in the program and in the outcome of the program and how they experience resources that are offered through the program. So what I'm saying, and I guess I should clarify that this is not the only way to define context, mechanism, outcome. It is important to be clear about your definition for your project and to justify why you have defined it in a certain way. But my general sort of take is that if you start, at least from a starting point, try to understand what are elements that are in the environment that are not formally part of the program. They're not explicitly intervention components, or they're not things that are made explicit as essential parts of the program, yet they are in the context and they have an impact on programs regardless. That is context, and that when we're talking about mechanisms, we are talking about program mechanisms. So we're talking about the mechanisms that get activated through the insertion of programs or interventions in environments. So, and I'm using program and intervention interchangeably. So I may use one or the other term, but I'm sort of saying the same thing. So that's key. So the mechanism has to do with the program, and the context has to do with the backdrop. So this is basically another way to depict the CMO configuration. So here we're saying, like I've said, context is elements of the backdrop of a program. And note here that I say the word element because you could think of everything as the context, everything that has manifested as the context, but you don't want to necessarily bring all of that into your analysis. You want to identify the key elements of the context that make a difference. And you may not be able to capture everything, but it's the part of the process of accumulating the knowledge is theorizing those key elements of context that make a difference, and then testing whether that does hold once you go through the data collection and analysis process. But here I've given examples of context. So values, competencies, assets, deficits, infrastructure. So you can think of these things as things in the backdrop. So what people value, like working in different communities, there are different cultural norms, there could be different values based on different experiences. And also there are varying degrees of capacity, competencies, assets in the community. There are also deficits in the context. Doesn't necessarily mean a community context, but there could be assets, there could be deficits in the context. And there's also some infrastructure or lack thereof. So those are some elements. So those are just examples. That's not exhaustive, but that's the kind of thing you're thinking about context. Thinking about mechanism, we're talking about resources. that the program provides and the reaction or response of participants or stakeholders. So the resources, can be information, it can be a feeling of safety, trust, engagement, motivation. Those are all examples of mechanisms. And I haven't separated out resource from reaction response in those examples, but I have a slide where I do, so I'll explain that further. And then outcomes. So you have outcomes of interest, as well as unintended effects based on context mechanism interaction. So tracing back to the interaction or the association between context and mechanism. Okay, so in this slide, this is where I do break down intervention resources and reactions. So basically reiterating what the last slide, but just going into a bit more detail. So you could think of context as the environment. Then we're talking about the physical environment, so anything that is materially present that has an impact, so physical structures, buildings, things that house interventions are housed in places, so those kinds of elements. Cultural aspects, and that can translate into what is important to people, what people value. Economic, whether it's resource poor or resource affluence. Psychological, interpersonal, institutional. So I mean, the sort of a random list there, but all of those things can pre-exist before the insertion of an intervention into an environment. And so it's causative factors falling outside of the parameters of the intervention, but have an impact on the intervention nonetheless. And then the mechanism, you're talking about the resources and the reaction. So in terms of intervention resources, so that could be a physical resource. An intervention could actually put technology into an environment, or they could be building of buildings. It could be economic, so it could be cash transfers, for example. So it's a monetary resource, informational, emotional resources, and then I have restrictive and permissive as well, because some resources are permissive resources. So they're resources that help people open up to feeling comfortable talking about aspects or elements that otherwise may be difficult to talk about, for example. So it could be a resource of giving permission to think in a certain way, or promote a certain kind of thinking. So resiliency-based interventions, those kinds of things. And it could also be restrictive. The resource could be a limitation. It could be a restriction, seatbelt laws, for example, or age restrictions for smoking or alcohol use, those kinds of things. So those can also be subsumed under resources. Although resources, the word resource has a much more positive connotation than restrictive. So it's a bit awkward to think of a restrictive resource, but we are grappling with language, and we're trying to overcome the limitations of language. Maybe there are better ways to articulate it. You can tell me. But so basically, these are causative factors attributable to the intervention. So you have an intervention, you have an intervention theory, and it's really about the actual insertion of the intervention into environments. And the reaction response part can be cognitive, it can be like a thought process. It could be emotional, so it could be about how people feel. It could be an emotional reaction. It could be conscious or subconscious, which complicates things, because how do you conduct realist qualitative interviews with people, asking them about their response when sometimes the response may be subconscious, or maybe not fully subconscious, but just something that people haven't really thought through, even though they're reacting in certain ways they might not have thought through. And it can be positive, negative, or neutral. So that kind of encapsulates the range of responses, that it can be positive, meaning, in favor of the resources, enthusiastic about those resources, or negative, repulsed by them, or just no effect at all. And the effect, we're talking about outcome of interest, so that's obvious, but we're also talking about intermediate and or final results. They can be expected or unexpected, intended or unintended. We're really opening up the definition of outcomes to mean any kind of impact that this context mechanism association has. And that's how we're defining outcomes. So this is a bit of a recap from the last session, and this is introductory stuff that I've presented many times and have other videos on it. But this is something that I want to present to you, something that I haven't really presented before. So this is adapted from Positantili. So we're taking this idea of context plus mechanism equals outcome. That was their equation, which I think is brilliant. I really like it. And here, what I'm doing is I'm just re-articulating that in a different way. What I'm saying is that you have intervention theories that are say on the books. So the blueprints. You have the blueprints of the intervention, but then those blueprints get translated upon implementation. Once they get put into place in the manifested world, they manifest as resources. So here you have the red and the red connected. So the intervention theories through implementation manifest as resources. Those resources have an impact on how people react. And we're saying that this reaction part of the mechanism is the kind of key to outcomes. So we're saying that there's a resource reaction connection. So people will react to resources, but they will also react based on context. So in a sense, the reaction has two pressures on it. I mean, two influences. The influence from the resource and the influence from the context. And that's really what I want to talk about, is this interaction between the mechanism, resource, and the context, and what impact that has on people, how they feel, leading to outcomes. So I've taken that simple model and I've made it a bit more complex by working out an example here. Here, I've introduced a concept here of leveraging, which I think for me has been interesting. It's been useful to think of leveraging. So I'm going to work through this example here. So say you have an asset-based community development program to increase community level responses towards climate change adaptation. So the program theory is, I don't know if anybody's familiar with asset-based programs. They're programs that essentially try to identify assets already existing in people, in communities, to optimize to optimize the ability of people to organize and accomplish needed goals. So the program theory here, and this is a hypothetical example, so this is not an actual study. I'm just for exemplifying and conveying what I'm saying. I've created this hypothetical. So say the program theory is workshops to help resource-poor communities identify their pre-existing assets will serve to activate and organize these assets towards climate change adaptation. So, you can imagine that the people that are most resource poor are going to be the hardest hit by climate change, and they, more than many, need to organize and be prepared and be ready to adapt when the need arises. So when you look at the context mechanism interaction, this is this here. So now this is the program theory in implementation. So you think about the resources that are offered through the program. So it's facilitated workshops involving positive psychology, asset mapping, respect, and trust building. And that's very limited. I mean, if you were to do this study, you might come up with a much more robust set of resources. This is just to get a flavor of what I'm talking about. So if you picture that the core of this program is in the workshop delivery. People come to a workshop and they have resources given to them through this approach of positive psychology asset mapping, and the facilitators are committed to respectful communication and trust building. But the context could be, and it's not always the case, but it could be because of resource poverty, there could be, first of all, general hardship in life and stress associated with that, which creates a whole host of other issues and also a particular kind of psychology. There could be disengagement with outsiders or people that are supposed to be there to help. There could be disengagement because there could be past experiences, negative experiences of aid, for example, and there could be negative psychology. I'm a bit cautious to say that because it may not be the case at all, and it may be the case that there are communities that experience resource poverty where they're actually quite resilient and have a positive psychology. So it's not necessarily always the case that resource poverty creates this, but let's just say for hypothetical purposes that for at least some people, the hardship stress does lead to disengagement and there's some negative psychology. So then you have the context, you have the backdrop, and then you have the resources, and then you have the response. So the response, could it be, a realization of one's assets? One realizes the strengths one has. Does one experience increased optimism because of that and feeling heard and respected? Are these responses that emerge? And those would be obviously responses of interest. One would hope that that's what will happen. But then the question is about the question of leverage. That's how I see it, is does the injected resources have enough leverage to overcome the barriers in the context? This is the example that this is this is not always the CMO, but this is one way that the CMO might turn out, which is really about this question of, does the mechanism have enough leverage to overcome contextual barriers? And if it does, then you could say that there's a positive effect. So there's maybe perhaps strategic community asset planning for climate change adaptation. So in the best case scenario, the resources overcame any barriers, psychological barriers from resource poverty and hardship from that. It overcame that and moved straight into adaptation planning, strategic planning, which would be the outcome of interest. There could be no change, or it could be a neutral effect. So it wasn't negative per se. There was no damage done, but there was also no benefit. But there could also be a negative effect in the sense that things could end up being worse than they were before, because it could reify negative thinking if it's not delivered in the right way. If there's broken trust towards outsiders, and that might be another effect in terms of no adaptation efforts, because the whole project might get truncated if the facilitation is not sensitive or tailored or doesn't meet people's needs, etc. So, but going back to the main point here, what I'm saying is this concept of leveraging is one of my central concepts in this presentation. Okay, so let's just look at another. Okay, so just recapping from that one, what I'm saying is that you may be leveraging program mechanisms against barriers in the context. So when you think of leverage, the definition of leverage is, one of the definitions of leverage is to use something to maximum advantage. So you want to use, it's like saying you want to use those program mechanisms, the resources of the intervention you want to use those to their maximum advantage to overcome the barriers in the context. And then the question becomes, does the delivery of, say, X number of asset development workshops, so maybe there's 6, maybe there's 12, I don't know the number. I mean, this is hypothetical. We don't know the magic, like the number that would be the correct number, but say it's a question to be asked. Does the delivery of X number of asset development workshops, sorry about that, excuse that, it's very rude. This too. Okay. Does the delivery of X number of asset development workshops with whatever content involved have enough leverage to counter disengagement, negative psychology, and mistrust in the context? And so there's a number of unknowns here because we're looking at the content of the workshop, but also the number of times the workshop is delivered, because there is an impact of repeated attendance to workshops, which we won't necessarily get into in this session, but those are the kinds of things that are worth thinking about. And so now I'm switching to another way that leveraging can be understood. So leveraging resources in the context to support program mechanisms. So in the example I just gave you, we're talking about leveraging mechanisms to overcome context. Here, what I'm saying is another way that leveraging can occur is that there are pre-existing resources in the context that can be leveraged to push the mechanism to make sure those mechanisms get triggered. And so what is leveraged consciously or unconsciously is the question. What is leveraged consciously or unconsciously in the context to ensure the activation of the right kinds of mechanisms to maximize program outcomes? Okay, so that's that. When I say consciously or unconsciously, what I'm saying there, maybe it should be implicitly, explicitly, is that when an intervention is put into a context, there are inherently the context is going to be used, resources in the context are going to be used, and it's possible that nobody's even aware that there's a reliance on pre-existing resources for the functioning. If you don't theorize those resources properly from the context, then you may scale up the program in a context where those resources don't exist in a new context, and the program fails. But you won't know why it fails, or you won't have any hunches about why it fails. So that is, that's why it's very important to theorize the impact of context. And then the question is, what is under-theorized about the role of resources in the context to explain outcomes? And I'm going to give you an example just to help, because it's hard to think about it in the abstract. So again, we're talking about leveraging. So here's the example. So you have, say, a subsidy program to encourage homeowners to retrofit homes with clean energy heating systems. So say geothermal system or solar panels or some other technology. So again, this is a hypothetical example. I'm not actually referring specifically to a project, but just say the program theory is that a home visit consultation with a heating systems expert, in addition to financial subsidy for retrofitting, will motivate homeowners to retrofit their homes with clean energy heating systems. Okay, that's a very simple program theory. I mean, if you did this study, you might come up with many different theory components that would fit together. So maybe this could be one theory component. So I'm just trying to create something clear enough that we can use as a learning example. So it's this idea that the intervention itself is really about an expert in clean energy technology coming to the home, looking around, inspecting the home, giving advice to the homeowner, and also offering a subsidy. And so here, context takes on a different form, because in the previous example, we were talking about resource poverty, hardship, stress, those deficits, those things that resource poverty creates, the deficits that creates in the context. Here, we're talking about context in terms of the communication competencies, knowledge, and aptitude of the expert. So you have the expert consult going into the home, but what we're saying is this program it doesn't train the expert in communication style. One assumes that the expert already has an ability to communicate to communicate the information well, and is generally socially savvy, is able to have the interaction, etc. So we have the program theory, and then in implementation, the resource, how it manifests is there's a home visit involving information, discussion, and maybe the delivery of convincing arguments, plus the subsidy incentive. And the response could be feeling convinced or feeling motivated to make steps towards retrofitting. And then we have similar to the last one, we have the positive effect, which would be, retrofitting home with clean energy system. There could be no change. It could be just neutral. It's like you got the advice, but just not interested. Or there could be a negative effect. Could be reified negative thinking. It could say, why do I need this? This is just unnecessary hassle for my life, which is already I'm too busy. Or it could be new resistance to retrofitting if the whole experience was negative. So the question again is about leveraging. To what extent do the facilitators, the consultants going into the home, have their communication competencies intact, have knowledge and aptitudes suited for the consultation and the delivery of the resources. So I think this is very important, actually, because this is the key here. What I'm saying in terms of the transformation, innovation, and transformation of programs. So I'll cut to the sort of the main message of what I'm saying is that if you start off with a program that has a program theory, that if in this example, consultant goes to the home, and you've not really theorized the core competencies of the deliverer of the intervention, in which case it would be this clean energy consultant. You may, in scale up, then you need to find more and more people. Say this becomes incredibly successful initially. So they have a group of 10 of these consultants, and they do a study, and they find that there's a huge response rate, and everything is successful. But what you may not have realized is that those small group of people, they're highly motivated to communicate attentively and intelligently, persuasively, with respect, and with skill. And that if you don't have that as a pre-existing condition, pre-existing attribute, that maybe the whole intervention might take a different turn. And this is not something that's formally part of the intervention. But doing a study where you realize that that's important, what you might do is innovate the program so that you incorporate a training manual for how to communicate with your client around issues around clean energy technology. So that could be something that evolves through a realist evaluation study, where you realize that there are elements of the context that are actually really so important that they need to be imported and become part of the formal architecture of the program. Okay, so that's the message that that's if you understand that point, then I feel like my goal for this session has been accomplished, is really saying that there is some interchange between elements of the context and elements of the program, and that through iterations of the program over time, you may pull in to the formal blueprint of the program those elements that were otherwise under-theorized and not realized, part of the context that actually make a difference. And competencies, for example, is one of those things. Another example, say if you did an intervention that was a school-based intervention where teachers are delivering the intervention. What are their competencies and their position, their social position within the school institution? What impact does that have? I heard of a very interesting case where there was a randomized controlled trial being conducted in a number of sites, and halfway through those sites, the implementers of the intervention went on strike. So the researchers had to decide what to do. Should they halt the RCT or should they continue? They said, let's continue, but we will have the intervention delivered by lay health workers instead of the employed staff that were delivering it. And so then there was interesting discussions on their team about, well, what is the impact of the deliverer on the intervention? And there were some people that saying, well, the intervention is the intervention, doesn't matter who delivers it, it's the intervention that's really making the effect. And then other people saying, no, actually the delivery process is also part of the intervention. And so if you take that as true, that the delivery is also part of the intervention, then whoever is delivering it, whatever their background is, their background competencies, their expertise, or lack thereof, is going to have an impact. And so that's, again, where you see this association between the context and the mechanism. Okay, so I hope that's clear. And I put together this diagram just for the purposes of our visual understanding. I don't know how useful it is, but it's just to say that you have context, and then you have you have an intervention that is placed in the context, and it has an interaction with the inner context and the outer context. So I've made a separation here between inner and outer, which is a bit beyond the scope of our discussion today. We can't really go into it, but you could, for example, for just for the purpose of exemplifying that, if you put an intervention into an institutional context, then the inner context could be the institution, while the outer context can be the broader societal norms, values, and that kind of thing. That's not necessarily always the case. You don't always divide up inner and outer that way, or you maybe don't need to create those distinctions, but it's something to consider. And this idea that the intervention, it sort of creates effects, and it may create these kind of ripple effects in the context. So, the question is, how are you theorizing your program? How are you seeing this interaction between the intervention mechanisms and the context? So I want to introduce. I have just a few more slides, and then we'll have questions. But I'm throwing out some ideas for your contemplation. Again, it's not about the right or wrong way to think about it, and you can build on these ideas if they are useful. So what I want to say is that the context mechanism association will depend on the nature of the program's basic architecture. Okay, so it's a bit of it's an advanced thought that is I'm still fleshing out this thought myself. So if it's not 100% clear, it's you can just, it's probably my fault, not your fault. So don't don't worry too much about it. It's hard to convey this in a short presentation, but what I'm saying, it's dependent on the nature of the program's basic architecture. And so one way to understand the nature of the program architecture is to see the extent to which the program is standardized versus open-ended. So standardized interventions are intervention resources that are fixed, structured, that are delivered exactly or more or less exactly the same across contexts. So for example, cash transfers, or an intervention where there is a deliverer that delivers a script that delivers exactly the same intervention in every instance. It's a fixed, structured, scripted kind of intervention. Or you could have an intervention that is open-ended, so that in that kind of scenario, you have resources that are customized to the context in the moment, and are pulled out of, say, like a toolkit. So the toolkit of resources for use as and when necessary. So not everything will be used. Some things may be used for certain circumstances or certain people. The intervention delivery is spontaneous and flexible to respond to the needs of particular circumstances. And certainly like in fields like, for example, mental health, recovery, and addiction, these kinds of interventions where it's open-ended are becoming increasingly favored because of the idea that individuals need particular resources for their given moment. So not everything is going to work for everybody, and that you need to be customized. You need to customize your intervention. But there might be other cases where the standardized approach is more appropriate, or is just the way the intervention works. Um, Cash transfers, for example, may be standardized, a form of standardized intervention where if you qualify for a cash transfer, there's a process that you go through and you receive that, and then that comprises the intervention. And then there's another dimension of understanding the program's architecture, which is about inserting new versus catalyzing existing resources. So it's inserting new resources into context to enhance the context or fill in deficiencies. So like I said, cash transfers or technology. So for example, with the retrofitting example, it could be the insertion of clean energy technology. It could be education. So you're actually giving people training, information, education. You're inserting new resources. Or you could be catalyzing pre-existing resources to activate and or reorganize those resources that are already existing to accomplish outcomes of interest. So for example, asset-based programs, resiliency promoting interventions. So these are interventions that are I mean, they are still inserting new resources, but they are inserting the kind of resources that are catalysts. So, I mean, if you think of like, you know, the difference between a medical intervention where, you know, there's surgery or something very big versus something like a vaccine, like the catalyzing in resources are maybe not major insertions of physical or economic resources in the intervention, but you know, a, a process by which resources that are already existing in the context are known, become known, and become activated in a sense, and reorganized. And so that's a spectrum. And so you might end up, I'm putting this out there for you to think about, you know, where does your intervention, if you're working on an intervention, where does it fit along these lines? And maybe it's the case that there are multiple components to your intervention, and some of them are about inserting new resources and others are about catalyzing pre-existing resources. But to really understand this context mechanism association, I think it's necessary to become clearer and clearer about the nature of the program architecture. What is the program? What is its basic nature about how it works? And then theorizing that as part of the realist process becomes very, very important. So I've thrown out a bunch of ideas and thoughts. We are almost at 50 minutes. I think, yeah, okay, last two slides. Program innovation through understanding the context mechanism association. So if you were to really think through understanding this context mechanism association, so one step is to identify the intervention components in relation to elements of the context. So to really crystallize your thinking around what is the program and the parameters of the program. So there's the program, but that at a certain point that there are parameters around that, and the rest of it is context. To theorize the components, so explaining how they work, including the mechanisms, and then to theorize elements of the context that are critical to the intervention's functioning. And the intervention will rely on pre-existing resources from the context, regardless of whether or not those resources are explicitly recognized. I think that's a very, very important point. It's a good starting point to realize that you may have theorized your program, but there are still elements of the context that are working that play a role, that don't have a lot, that aren't given the credit really it deserves, they deserve. And one of those things, as an example, is prior competencies, skills, knowledge of people involved in interventions and delivering interventions. Program innovation through understanding the context mechanism association. Elements of the context, if determined to be critically important to the successful functioning of the intervention, may be re-theorized as an intervention component in future iterations of the intervention. So this is the point I made earlier. This was my main take-home point, that you may bring in elements of the context and advocate that those elements be formally part of the blueprint of the program, so that during scale-up, those critical elements that were part of the context in the original study, in the original effectiveness trial or the original realist evaluation, was part of the context. But going forward, you've made that part of the blueprint and made that as an essential part of the program. But then that theory also needs to be tested in new environments because context is always changing. And so whether those theories hold about bringing in elements of the context into the program blueprints, whether that really holds in new context is always something that needs to be adjudicated. And a robust analysis of the context mechanism association can serve to innovate and transform intervention. So that was my final take-home message for the presentation. So that formally concludes the presentation. One thing I want to mention before we move to questions is about referencing, because I've delivered some original content in this webinar that you will not find elsewhere, or not likely to find elsewhere. So I encourage you, if this is useful, if it resonates and you're able to build, use this to build your own ideas, but you do want to reference that there is a way to reference webinars using your preferred referencing style. But if at any point you need to reference this, you can reference from here, or you can also send me an email and say that in the webinar you said XYZ, this is how I have written it out. Can I just get your confirmation? Because I'd like to reference you. And then you could also reference via personal communication. That's another way of referencing. So I encourage you to do that. Make use of it if it's useful. And I think that's all I have to say in the formal part of the presentation. Now we can go to questions. And I guess I've asked Peter if I could sort of take control of the questions, but Peter, if I run into any trouble, I will call upon you to help out. Okay, so yes, there are lots of questions. Great. And I would actually like to, if possible, I don't know, we weren't sure if it's possible or not, but if somebody wants to ask a question verbally, you can unmute your mic, because I think I have the controls here to unmute. Let's take a look at the questions first of all. Let's start, say, okay, we're going back to the top. So, okay, I have just a practical, okay, yes, the slides will be made available after the workshop. Yeah, okay. How important do you believe mid-range theory development is? Very important. Middle-range theory development is very important. But what I would say is important is my advice is, if you're studying an intervention, to develop your program theories first. Construct if-then statements or very clear program theories that explicate the program components and how they are working, and then think about your middle range theory. So you're building it from the ground up. And there might be circumstances where you don't do that. So if you're doing a literature review where there's a lot of heterogeneity amongst intervention types, and you're commissioned to do this, so you can't alter the design, then you might go straight to middle range theories. This is something that I talk about in detail in my workshops about the difference between program theory and middle range theory, and there's definitely overlap. But to answer the question, yes, very important, very, very important. 10 out of 10. The next question: how important or applicable is the concept of demi-regularity? It's important. The thing is, I would need to explain what a demi-regularity is to really do justice to the question. But I would say that middle range theory is more important. Demi-regularity is something that I encourage you to look up. It comes from critical realism and is also used in realist evaluation. It's a useful concept. It's just basically meaning semi-predictable patterns of outcomes. We don't say that there are universal laws, like universal regularities. We always think that a regularity, meaning a regular occurrence of something, will always depend on context, and we want to be open to context variation, and that's why we say demi-regularity. Next question: how do you define the parameters of the program intervention? Can it include the implementation elements such as recruitment, retention strategies, which are in addition to program content? These additional strategies can influence leveraging process. Yes, exactly. That's a great question. That's a fantastic. That's exactly the kind of question that I think you should be asking. And how do you define the parameters? Can it include implementation elements, such as recruitment and retention? Implementation is kind of a special case. So you have context. You have certain elements of the context that are clearly context. So previous competencies, or if it's, like I talked about, stress, hardship, those kinds of things, those are clearly the backdrop of the program. Implementation is somewhere is sort of like in this bit of a gray area between context and the program. But if you're talking about elements such as recruitment, retention strategies, I think these additional strategies can influence the leveraging process. Yes, exactly. So I think that those would most likely be within the parameters of the program, because implementation is very much linked to the insertion of mechanisms in environments. Implementation has to do with the environment and how fertile or infertile the environment is to receiving the intervention. That's why the concept of implementation really does cross over. It can be seen as context, and it can be seen as part of the program mechanisms. There's overlap. But I do tend to think of it more in terms of the within the boundaries of the program, so that your program theorizing can include a whole set of program theories that have to do with the implementation of the program. And I know that some people are working on projects where they're studying their sole investigative question is about implementation. They're not questioning the program itself or the intrinsic logic of a program. They're questioning, how does this program get uptaken? But that leads to some interesting questions, because how the program gets uptaken is dependent on the backdrop, on the context, but it's also dependent on the intrinsic properties of the program itself, and you can't escape that. So it's an interesting paradox for some people, because if some people, I know who I've had these conversations with people who are doing projects where they're just studying the implementation. So there's a project that has demonstrated effectiveness, and now they're just studying scale up. But we still have to theorize the program and understand the interaction between the context and mechanism to really become clear about implementation issues. But it's a great question. We need to keep thinking about it. Sure. So the next question is, surely some assumption need to be made for the CMO mechanism to work. Your explanation seems to suggest that there is a closed system and that there are no resource leakages. Wow, what a fantastic comment. This is the kind of question that I actually need to unmute the mic and for us to have a back and forth conversation. So I don't mean to evade the question, but it's really that kind of question that we need to have a number of question and counter questions so we really get at the heart of what is being said and what is, the comment that's placed here. I think it's a fantastic insight. So if that person unmutes their mic, you can say hello. And if you're comfortable doing so, you don't have to, but if you're comfortable doing so,
Hi, Justin.
hi there. Hi,
Peter
Peter.
here. I think I have managed to unmute that person. So if they wanted to,
Oh, okay. Is it Adisa? Hello, can you hear me? Well, you've unmuted the mic, but it might not be working just yet. Or hello there. Hi, can you hear me?
they may not be ready for us. I think we may have
Yeah,
sprung a
that
surprise.
that's fine. If that person, if you at some point want to try unmuting your mic, you can just mute it and just say a little hello, and then I can come back to your question. Okay, so the next question is, based on your idea of the importance of leveraging mechanisms, should we be considering the idea of MCO configurations? Yes, well, whether it's CMO or MCO, you can consider that. And if you've spoken to Ray Pawson about it, you'll know that originally they had thought about this idea that the CMO configuration would actually be MCO, so putting mechanism first. I think that it's not so critical which one comes first, as long as you've captured the context and the mechanism, and you define those terms. That's what's important. Okay, another question. I'm very skeptical. Oh, sorry, I think I skipped this one. How would you consider realist approaches in relation to scalability of programs? So is the question, how would you use realist approaches for understanding the scalability of programs? That would be a more, I think, answerable question. And the answer to that question would be yes, you can use realist approaches to theorize the scalability of programs. But what's interesting here is that, if you were to theorize the scalability of programs, would you be doing that before programs are scaled out? Or would you scale out programs and study how programs have interacted in their context to understand? And I think realistically, it's the latter. It's really, you can use realist evaluation to do an evaluation of programs that have been scaled up to understand when programs are introduced in new contexts, how those contexts interact with the program mechanisms. Yes, so the next question, I'm very skeptical about the CM leveraging. Okay, good. I'm glad. We need to be critical about it. How realistic is it that the relationship between resources, responses, effect is linear? Surely programs are messier than this. Yes, and that's a very good point. And it's the kind of critical thinking that will ensure your success, because that's absolutely true that things are not so linear. But what happens in a realist project is that we do need to create some form of simplification of the complexity to affect, to achieve the kind of insights we want to achieve. So there is something artificial about creating a linear CMO configuration. It's a heuristic. So it's an aide-memoire, as Ray Pawson defines it. It's a mental uh, uh, exercise. The CMO configuration is something to just help you sort through complexity. So in the process of sorting through complexity, you are simplifying and you're creating maybe some linear looking models. But you might end up doing an analysis where you have a number of these different linear models, and then you put it together to form a bigger picture, a more comprehensive picture of the interaction of these things. So that doesn't mean that your skepticism should be diminished. It's good to be skeptical. And we need to have a sustained conversation about this, really, to really get at the heart of it, you know, for me to hear really where you're coming from. But I do like that line of questioning. I think it's important. Another question, kindly explain how to start up a realist review on supported educations for adults with severe mental disorders. Okay, um, I just laughed there because that's a very, very uh, big question. Um, and I can encourage you to look at my first video tutorial, as well as the video tutorial on my website, on the front page of the website, where I do talk about the process of doing a realist evaluation. You start by constructing your program theories, but you might start with your evaluation questions, and then you theorize your intervention. You identify the key intervention components and you theorize those components. And then then you can theorize the key context factors, and then you develop data collection protocols. You collect data, you analyze data using the CMO configuration, and you say something about the theories that you had constructed at the outset. So you create evidence-informed theories. But I won't go into that because we talked about that in the first session. Explain stages of the review with examples. Thank you. Okay, you're very welcome. So I'm just going to skip forward here. Catherine, thanks, Justin. A great presentation clarifying my understanding of context. I was very definitely considering contexts as they related to the intervention. So I need to rethink this. So just for clarification, if staff involved in an intervention have volunteered to be involved, would you consider this to be an inner or outer context? Okay, so without really getting into your study, so I mean, we would need to really go back into your study and really think about the intervention itself. The question is, if staff have volunteered to be involved, so I'm assuming that staff are implementing the intervention, would this be an inner or outer context? Well, you know, it depends how you define inner and outer. So there's no right or wrong. I would say inner context, because for me, outer context might be broader macro social forces, broader cultural, you know, values and those kinds of things, where the competencies of the deliverer of an intervention could be seen as inner context. And why? Because it is more closely connected to the intervention itself, whereas social cultural norms is something that's much more diffuse in the backdrop of the intervention. That's more of an outer context, whereas the skills or the attributes of the implementer is more closely connected to the intervention. Okay. Okay, thank you for a wonderful talk. My question is it possible a given program necessitates to have both inserting new and catalyst interventions? You know, I think my answer to that is that it can be definitely both happening at the same time. It's obviously it doesn't have to be. So it's not always, you don't always have an intervention that is simultaneously inserting new resources as well as catalyzing existing resources. But when you look closely at interventions, you might find that there are more interventions than not that are actually doing that implicitly. So the implicit sort of reworking, the implicit mechanism of these catalyzing interventions is reorganizing these resources in the context. And that reorganization of resources might trigger new mechanisms. So in a sense, the identification of assets, so the reorganization of those assets in terms of a coordinated response measure, say for climate change adaptation, these things can be elements of the context and mechanisms that are triggered from that reorganization and identification. So I hope that made sense. But yes, so it is possible that you could have intervention that's doing both, and it's possible that you could have interventions that are basically on one side or the other, catalyzing or inserting new resources. Okay, another question. I'm working with a realist research group Peter, how much time do we have left
Well, we have another 5 minutes on the schedule, but I think
on
people
the
can
clock?
people can stay on as long as they want. I'm here to as long as we need, so there's no immediate rush in that
Okay.
sense.
Well, I'll just go through the rest of these questions. I think that'll be possible, hopefully just within 5 minutes or maybe just a little bit over. Okay, so the next question is, I'm working with and Peter, can people read these questions? Are these questions visible to other people?
I don't think they are.
No. Okay, so I'll just make sure I read them clearly.
Mhm.
So this question is, I'm working with a realist research group and recently showed them my initial theories. They felt I have overworked them as I know the topic very well, and that they were reading more like middle range theories before I had even completed my research. Is this a common problem? I don't know if it's a common problem. You mean if it's a common problem to have people tell you that you've overworked your theories? It's actually not a problem that I see over and over, but I think it's an interesting issue that would need to look at your theories and what does that mean, overworked? Um, because the fact that you know your topic very well may mean two things. It may mean that you have some very deep insights about the nature of these programs because you know these programs, or it may mean that you're blinded to certain factors because your perception around the program has been really reified along certain dimensions, and it's harder to see other dimensions that are important. So both of those things could be happening. So we would need to really look at your specifics to to understand, and I would be happy to do that, Catherine, if you wanted to get in touch. So, but good to see that you're working hard, and that it's the fact that the theories are overworked just means that you've been working very hard at it. So that's something positive, I think. But we would need to look at those theories specifically, and I need to really understand what that meant, what the critique exactly was, like in terms of overworked. Next question, can you say something about resources when the program blueprint is designed by health service managers? The researchers have no control over intervention, and the resources change over time of the intervention. Um, 1 second. I'm just going to repeat that. So the question is, can you say something about resources when the program blueprint is designed by health service managers? The researchers have no control over intervention, and the resources change over time of the intervention. So I'm not 100% sure I understand your question, but what I would say is that it's very often the case that health service managers and other types of managers put programs into place. So they are the architects of the program, but they may not have properly theorized the program themselves. So they are operating on some limited assumptions about how the program is working, or who knows, maybe even no assumptions, because maybe they're reorganizing, putting out interventions that are have arisen due to funding cuts or some emergency or something that they don't have time or they haven't theorized the intervention. So the researchers have no control over the intervention. So that's okay. That's a reality, and the resources change over time. So what the role of the researcher is to document how those resources have changed over time, and to point out to those policy architects those elements of the context that are actually very key, so that if the opportunity arises to scale up those programs, they will already start having hunches and suspicions about how the program will work differently in different contexts. And then you may, as the researcher, may make recommendations in your report on those elements of the context that need to be considered as formal aspects of the program. So what happens when you take an element of the context and you build it into the blueprint of the program is what you're saying then is that in scale up, that element of the context now has to be in place in every other context. Okay, and so that's saying that will ensure. So going back to the example of the retrofitting, the technology, the green technology expert retrofitting consultant to retrofit homes, you may decide at the end of an evaluation that every consultant needs to go through a training program where they develop specific communication style, which may not have been part of the original study. So those kinds of things is what I'm talking about in terms of the innovation. So I hope I've answered your question, but you can tell me if not. Another question, I'm exploring evaluation approaches for policy advocacy work. So exploring if the realist evaluation would be one of the appropriate approaches. Are there examples that I can refer to know how it works for policy advocacy work? That's a great question. My recommendation is to post that question on the Ramsey's discussion board, because there are now more than 800 people on that forum, and very enthusiastically helping each other. And people are connected to different literature in the realist evaluation field and may point you in some interesting directions. So if you're not already on that forum, you can send me an email and I'll send you instructions for joining. And yeah, that's a great kind of question to pose for the forum. Another question, we are looking at developing a supported education program for persons with severe mental disabilities. Based on the examples given, am I right in saying that elements of the program and the reasons for implementing the program can be included in the mechanism, and aspects of the therapist skills, I think that's aspect of the therapist skills and the client illness level can be part of the context? Yes. Okay, so I'll just repeat that. So it says, based on the examples given, am I right in saying that elements of the program and the reasons for implementing the program can be included in the mechanism? That's correct. Yes. So elements and the reasons can be as part of the mechanism. An aspect of the therapist's skills and the client illness level is part of the context. So client illness level is definitely part of the context, because you would never import the client's illness level into the formal program architecture. That's always going to be a backdrop. But the skill level of the therapist is something that is either a context or a mechanism, depending on how you have theorized the program. So like I've said, then in your original study, you may determine that different therapists have different skill levels based on their discipline, their years of experience, etc. And that is part of the context for your original study. But as you develop your evidence-informed theories about the program, you might suggest, in terms of guidelines moving forward, that all therapists need a base level of skill along a certain lines, and that some training is to be developed for that, and then it becomes part of the program. So it's exactly what I was saying there. So I hope that's clear, and that shows you again that what is context and what is mechanism can overlap or can interchange from one study to the next. You might also have an issue where if you're doing a realist review and you're studying, say, an intervention, say, for example, a safe injection site. This is a site where people who have drug addiction can come and safely inject their drugs in a non-judgmental location with informed staff that are involved in a harm reduction approach. But if you do a literature review on the effectiveness of this, you might find that some of these sites are community-based, so they're storefront organizations, and others might be located in medical clinics and maybe even as a part of a hospital outpatient clinic. So the impact of that context difference is a big question. Does that change the nature of the program and how people receive the program and the intended outcomes? And so you might find that those are contextual variations in your original study. So, community-based versus hospital-based could be part of the context. But then going forward, you may make recommendations that include the physical location as part of the program theory. That, for example, the safe injection site needs to be placed in X physical location, or it needs to be in the community, or if it's in the hospital setting, the staff need to have a different kind of training. So this is the innovation that I'm talking about. It's this context mechanism association, thinking about that is thinking about how to innovate these programs to customize and tailor these programs to different contexts. Okay, next question. Could you please send us a link to your website? The link to the website is on the front page of this presentation. So you will have that. It's www.realistmethodology-cares.org. So realist methodology, one word, dash cares, cares.org. But you will see the website address on the front page. I can even pull it up for you now. Yeah, so it should be there. And thank you so much for this webinar. This is the last question. Thank you so much for this webinar. Could you, please, could you tell us if we can watch your earlier webinar recording online? And yes, I confirmed with Peter that the earlier webinar is online and in the CCAN. If you go to past events in the CCAN website, you should be able to find it. So I've been told. I actually think that I saw it on YouTube as well. You can also check out my session on my website. On the front page, there's a video, and it does go through pretty much the same material, more or less, as the examples are different, but more or less the same material that I went through in the first CCAN webinar. So you can access either of those. And that is the end of the questions. So, and we're definitely over time, so I don't want to take up any more time. But Peter, thank you so much for hosting this and for going over time. And if there's is there anything else?
All I was going to say is we've had lots of people asking to get hold of the slides and the video. So the session has been recorded. The easiest way to find this session and the past sessions is on the CCAN website. If you just go to news and then videos, you can find it there. Also, we have a YouTube channel. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook. If you just search for CCAN, CECAN, hopefully that's all fairly easy to find. Of course, get in touch with us. The email address is ccan@surrey.ac.uk. You can find that on our website as well. Or, of course, get in touch with Justin or myself directly. But yeah, I think all I wanted to say as well, Justin, is thank you very much for a very in-depth, very interesting session again. Been very well attended, we're very pleased. And yes, thank you very much. We'll call it a day for now.
Well, thank you again, and it was my pleasure. Okay. So, great. Okay, well, thanks.
Bye-bye.
And have a great evening. Bye. Take care. Bye.